Economists who don't understand basic economics. Man, it's I'm listening to an audio by a guy named Bob Murphy, who's an Austrian economist, and I like Bob Murphy. I'm a fan of his because I'm a fan of Austrian economics. But he has his podcast, which I like a lot, called Contra Krugman, and he takes on Paul Krugman. And one of the most recent episodes Bob Murphy's done. I was taking on the Krugman article he had written in the New York Times, talking about the inverted yield curve. Now, Krugman is the left's go-to guy for economic theory because he spouts the left-wing talking points. I mean, he's all fond of China. You know, he said when Trump is elected, we'll never recover, and the whole thing. I mean, whatever. But here's Bob Murphy, who should know better. And so, look, it's easy to bash the Krugman. I mean, the guy's... look, he's a liberal, and he just happens to be an economist, and he won the Nobel Prize, which just shows you the Nobel Prize in of itself isn't all it's cracked up to be. But anyway, so here comes my man Bob Murphy, and Bob Murphy should know better than some of what he was just pronouncing. Both these guys are PhDs in economics. I don't know where Krugman, probably an Ivy League school. Bob Murphy from New York University. But, all right, so here's Bob Murphy. Well, first of all, let me start with Paul Krugman. Paul Krugman says this is how just removed these guys are from reality. So real quick, let me start with a point. Some guy said, you should leave economics to economists, Josh. You're not an economist. Look, I don't give two craps what a guy says about me. I literally don't care. The issue is I don't understand this appeal to authority. I don't get it. This credential set is the only people who can speak on various issues. That just is weird to me. Why would you... I don't understand. I mean, I get it because the technocrats are always on the left, and the technocrats want to control you and me and thus of us who are not... I don't want to say on the right, but most people don't want the technocrats controlling their day-to-day activities, because most people say, I know best for me. And the technocrats, be it from Ivy League school or otherwise, or London School of Economics, they don't know me. And so because that, there is no appeal to authority that's inherent in human nature other than, I don't get it. I've never understood, if you don't have credentials, you can't speak on various issues. It's just as weird to me. And like, you can say whatever you want about me. I don't care. But stop this appeal to authority, man. It's heartbreaking in its numbness, to be perfectly honest with you. But all right, let's go on to what Krugman said. So Krugman said, which is silly in itself, and you can see the sunshine in my eyes. I get my sunglasses on. That didn't really do much. That did nothing. All right, so Krugman, I got to put my eyes up there because my visor isn't quite shielding my eyes. I'm not tall enough. Just in case you're wondering, I'm about 5'9", 5'9.5", in case you're wondering how tall I was. And I'm about 185 weight, just in case you're ever wondering, how big is old Josh? All right, so Krugman says that what happens are when people think a recession is happening, they stop, they do whatever they stop consuming because they think the Fed is going to lower interest rates. I mean, that's what he says. So when people think a recession is coming, they stop consumption because they think the Federal Reserve is going to lower interest rates and make consumption cheaper, and they can resume consumption once that happens. Can you think how absurd that is? That mom and pop sitting around their kitchen table saying, time's getting tight at the plant. I better not buy this extra piece of bacon. Instead, I'll buy some Spam because recession's coming, and I want to wait till the Federal Reserve reduces interest rates. Just what kind of bubble do these people live in at the New York Times? It's insane. Did you hear about Bret Stephens? He was purportedly their conservative writer who hates Trumpster, by the way. And some guy said, hey, I hope you don't have bed bugs at your New York. And some guy on the left said, Bret Stephens, you're like a bed bug, calling out that the New York Times has bed bugs in their office. And Bret Stephens flipped out on the guy. I was like, what? Where is these bubbles that you all live in at the New York Times? It's insane. But I mean, Paul Krugman to sit there and say, mom and pop are not going to buy the extra pound of bacon because they think recession's coming and times are getting tight, and they're going to wait for the Federal Reserve to reduce interest rates. No one talks like that. But only economists should be able to talk about economics. This is freaking insane, man. The idea. But then we go to Bob Murphy, and he doesn't chastise Krugman for that. He chastised Krugman for not understanding how an inverted yield curve comes to be in the beginning. And he's wrong. So Bob Murphy says inverted yield curve doesn't come up because longer term rates drop. They come up because short term rates spike. But that's not what happens. I'm stunned at the level of incompetence in these economists and they just lack of basic economic understanding. The freaking inverted yield curve doesn't come up because short-term rates spike. What would cause short-term rates to spike? Think about it. It's in a huge drop-off in demand. Short-term rates don't just spike. This is insane. It's a huge drop-off in demand, which would make in short-term rates spike, and yet the long-term rates either have more demand, which would make the short-term rates, would make the long-term rates drop, or they have the same amount of demand. That's not how it works. I don't get it. Anywhere and everywhere, when bad times come, there's always a flight to quality, i.e. government bonds of all shapes and sizes. A short-term spike doesn't happen because people are afraid to lock in short-term money, and thus the demand drops off a cliff. It's the exact opposite. Now, you can make an argument in 1980 and 82, that the short-term rates are higher than the long-term rates because of inflationary worries. But you can make that argument, but that simply wasn't what happened in 2008. Short-term rates didn't spike. Simply is not what happening now that short-term rates are spiking. I mean, it's just this. I literally don't understand these models. I don't get it. I mean, just look, man. Short-term rates don't spike because, again, the inherent reason a short-term rate would spike would be why people are removing the demand from the bonds. Maybe they're removing the demand from the bonds because the Feds are going to lower interest rates. But why would that make that even of itself doesn't make sense? That doesn't make sense. If the Fed is lowering interest rates, that means you're going to have more of a bump in your price on the short-term side because lower interest rates of new bonds being issued means the older bonds with higher interest rates are worth more. It's just weird to me, man. I don't understand. I mean, look, I just don't get it. I'm sitting there thinking, are people pulling this out of the air and where the sun doesn't shine? Because it's just odd. Think about it. You're worried about a recession. Thus, you think short-term rates are going to be dropped by the Federal Reserve. What's the one thing you don't do? Well, you don't drop your short-term bonds, because if they do drop the short-term rates, then the price of your bond inherently goes up that you own right now because the short-term rates have dropped. And anytime interest rates drop, the price of bonds goes up. It's just all there is to it. Oh, but Josh, those short-term bonds will mature faster than a long-term bond. Well, exactly. That's why the long-term bonds, the demand for the long-term bonds jumps up too, because what happens is the demand for the long-term bonds jumps up. The demand for the short-term rates also jumps up, but the demand for the long-term bonds will drop the rates more because there's more duration risk in longer-term issue than bonds. And I don't want to get one. Maybe I will. All right. So what happens? When the interest rates change, it's almost like leverage if you think about it. So if you think about a wrench, say you got a wrench to get rid of your lug nuts on your vehicle. All right, the shorter handle, the more force and torque you got to put in to turn the lug nut. The longer the handle, the more leverage you have. Does that make sense? And the same thing happens in bonds. It's just like torque and leverage with any kind of like a pulley system or anything like that. The longer that you can make it, the less torque you have to apply, the less force you have to apply, because the leverage will increase the force amount, if that makes sense. So what happens here is, there we go. So what happens here is on a short-term bond, it's just not much leverage. There's just not much there. It's like a short-term handle on a wrench to take off the lug nut off your car. But the longer term is flux, it goes like this. So you kind of go like that. So you see what I'm saying? So the more it changes on the short end, the more the ripple effect will be on the long. And so what happens is the lower the coupon and the higher the the longer the maturity, the more the market is going to go up and down like that in terms of the price fluctuation of the bonds. So a zero coupon bond always has more jump than a 10% bond, if that makes sense. And I know maybe I'll get on the whiteboard and show you that at some point, but That's what happens with bonds. The higher duration risk, i.e. the more volatility in the bond, is going to be based on the longer term maturity and the coupon. The smaller the coupon, the higher the maturity, the more fluctuation there will be in price of the bond as interest rates change. So a zero coupon 30-year bond will have a whole lot more fluctuation than a 30-year bond or than a 5-year bond at 10% coupon. A whole lot more based on fluctuating of interest rates changing. And so with Bob Murphy sitting there thinking the short-term rates spike, well, they don't spike that much at all, simply because there isn't that much of a coupon to begin with. I mean, a coupon right now in a short term is like 50 basis points. So just use that for an example. So if you got 50 basis point a coupon, which is a low coupon, and you got a short-term bond, let's say 6 months to a year, that's not gonna have much volatility at all. So there isn't gonna be hardly any spike, any drop, anything in the share and the price of bonds, regardless of demand, and never mind the interest rates either. But there will be huge on a lower coupon 30-year bond, because right now the coupons are like less than, I think on a 30-year bond, I think it's less than 2 now. So there can be huge volatility on the 30 years, never mind, and then the 10 years too, relative to short term. And that just inherently makes sense, because those have more, there's more volatility in there. And because there's more volatility, there'll be more of a swing in the price per share. I hope that makes sense. And well, price per share, the price of the bond. And so to go back to economists who don't know basic economics, this is part and parcel of not knowing how this works. Am I going the right way? Yeah, where am I going here? I gotta find my physical therapist. But anyway, and that's how it works. And so if you have a short-term time check. Ooh, I gotta get there. So all right, let me cut this, because I'm not sure, because I had to drop off something for my kid, because he forgot stuff at home and he needed his big old pops. Yeah, there we go. We're going the right way up here. This thing might be a couple minutes late. Yeah. All right. So basically, inverted yield curves are not caused by consumers sitting around saying, hey, Grandma, should we buy that extra piece of bacon, or should we wait until the Federal Reserve reduces rates? That doesn't happen. And then secondly, inverted yield curves are not jumped by a spike in interest rates on the low end. They're started by a drop in interest rates on the back end, because people are buying up those longer term bonds. All right, so don't fall for the fallacy. You're not an economist. You're not a scientist. You're not a veteran. I hate that too. You're never in the Army. You have no business to comment on military affairs. I hate that as well. I've always hated that stuff, as if being in the military inherently makes you an expert on affairs of military stuff. That's stupid. What's the other one too? You weren't in the Army. You're not you're not an economist. You're not a climate scientist. You're not a nutritionist. How dare you comment on not being a nutritionist on nutrition? Oh, another one too is you don't have a PhD in education. Actually, it's kind of interesting. So I went to curriculum night for one of my kids the other day, and none of the teachers, no matter what they were teaching, had I don't know about their undergrad, but they did not have a graduate degree in the courses they were teaching, which is kind of a little bit frightening. Now, they all had graduate degrees in education, but I want graduate degrees in the courses you're teaching. I mean, obviously, it's wishful thinking, I get that, but if you're teaching science, wouldn't it be better to have a graduate degree in science, whatever that is, science? What's your grad degree in? Science. That'd be like saying, what's your graduate degree in? Money. But they did. They all had, look, I'm not here bashing anybody, not at all, but I just found it funny that, because all they're really looking at is a textbook. And if you know, the textbooks, especially on economics, science, and whatnot, are all driven by politics, man. All driven by politics. And then you guys question, do your teachers, they understand how this works? So they're just preaching out of the textbook. And the textbook says, from Paul Samuelson's economics model, that the Soviet Union would overtake the U.S. in 5 years economically, and its economic growth overtake the U.S. in like 5 years or something like that. And he said that in 1989. Scary. All right, we'll see you.